Ambassador Gautam, Mukhopadhaya, lots has changed since we last spoke. President Trump continuously keeps saying that the talks with the Taliban are dead. Secretary Pompeo has indicated there is a possibility of the doors being opened, so have the Taliban. What is your reading of, is there a possibility of talks resuming?
I think there's a little bit of a pressure from various sides to resume talks. And particularly the Taliban is pushing for talks. I think they realize that they missed an opportunity. Perhaps they overplayed their hand, and now they are going from country to country, trying to generate support for talks, as well as actually getting some support for talks from Pakistan, from Prime Minister Imran Khan. At the same time, of course, the desire for peace and for resumption of some process for peace talks also remains within Afghanistan. So I think it's quite natural that there will be a kind of, a kind of demand for peace talks, but I think the terms and conditions for those peace talks would have changed quite considerably, particularly if the elections are more or less successful.
Is there a coincidence, like you mentioned, that Pakistan and the Taliban both want talks at this point?
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to underline.
But when you're talking about pressure, now the Taliban have, they're giving public interviews both in Qatar, they went to Russia, they met the special representative there, they've been to Tehran as well. There's a demand even from within Afghanistan from certain players. President Karzai also saying that there should be a resumption of transparent talks.
Well, for two things. One is, of course, transparent. Nobody can deny that demand. The fact is that the first round of talks, the Khalilzad US-Taliban talks, were not at all transparent. We all know that, of course, that the Afghan government was only being briefed about the direct US-Taliban talks, and even at the final round, they were barely shown the interim agreement. So there is no question on the transparency of the talks. These are about the Afghan people. It concerns their future. Not only should they be transparent, I mean, the Afghan people have a say in it, and they have a right to know what is in that agreement and to debate and decide on it. So I think this is one part. The second part in which the whole situation would have changed is presumably elections will be held. We can't yet say right now exactly how successful it will be or what will be the outcome. But there does seem to be a desire. The sort of surveys give very different statistics, so it's difficult to comment. But there does seem to be a desire to vote even as an act of defiance against a process that completely left them out. Now, what will change is presumably at the end of this, there will be an elected government, maybe new, maybe the old government in some form or the other, with variations. And that will sort of refresh the legitimacy of both the constitution as well as the government. And that will provide the basis for Afghan-led talks. I think what is the second condition that is very important, that this time the talks are directly between the Taliban and the Afghan people. Afghan people, however they may be represented, that is for the Afghans to decide. But presumably after an election, it could be, for example, an umbrella of a representative opinion. Ideally, let's say, a representative opinion under the umbrella of the Afghan government.
Why are you so insistent that the election process should continue? When you talk about area or territory that the Taliban either controls or contests, if it's 50% or nearabouts that, how can there be free and fair voting?
Firstly,
security
I think,
situation,
yes.
The fraud that we have seen in the past
right.
from different sides.
Right. All those concerns are there, but I don't think we have ever used that as an argument to nullify or not hold elections anywhere. I think these are defects that we have to live with and actually try to correct in the process, institutionally correct. I mean, if the international community has such a lot of influence that it can decide on intra-Afghan talks without the Afghan government, surely it should have some process to ensure that the process of elections is also free. Now, it will also be a test to see exactly how much the Taliban actually control, because so far we are going by, by kind of assessments made by essentially outsiders. And let me put it like this, that if areas are outside the control of the government and let's say they cannot hold elections, wherever they do hold elections could also be taken or might also be taken as a barometer of support for a kind of, let's say, a republic as opposed to an emirates. And I think in many ways this will be a referendum on that. And so even if it's not held, I think people will draw the conclusion that if it could have been held, results would have been somewhat similar.
And how do you read the US State Department statement on the election process, which now they say all sides should ensure that there is free and fair election. They call on the Taliban not to disrupt that process. When those talks were going on, there was absolutely no mention of that at all.
Right. I think there are two things. I think a lot of those statements were fairly motherhood. I think they're trying to make the best of a new situation. Incidentally, they never completely excluded the possibility of elections. They, in a way, but I think clearly by scheduling intra-Afghan talks 5 days before the elections, their intention was to make the election irrelevant, so that people would actually doubt whether there is any purpose served by going and voting and risking their lives. Now it's different, because I think now it's a bit of a referendum on the, and why this is important is, look, this government has already overstayed or outlived its constitutional term. And you cannot have a constitutionally disputed government. And worse still, if you actually were to delay it indefinitely or not hold it or introduce any other mechanism, then you run the risk of going down a very slippery slope towards a constitutional vacuum.
Looking at the past, isn't that slippery slope still possible in terms of how long this process will draw out? Is there going to be a second round? Is there going to be disputes?
Correct. All that possibility is there, but at least there is let's say a speed breaker or a brake on it. And of course, this is a time to actually take stock and reset. And I think the first sort of reset is that there should be no third party talks. It should be bilateral talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government, or at least a representative Afghan delegation that the Afghan government is very much part of. Because it's not just about representativeness, it's also a question of authority. How can a non-official delegation have the authority to even implement the decisions? What is its legal status, particularly in this open situation? And actually, it puts the Afghan delegation, the government or the representative delegation, in a very weak legal ground vis-a-vis their interlocutors and rivals.
So if there's a speed breaker, a break now in the process, a pause, however you term it, how is India seeing this latest development or these developments, and what should we be doing in this process and post?
Yes, I think we came out with a statement which was a very definite support for the constitutional process for the elections, and I think this has always been our position. I'm glad that the government has come out with a firm statement on that. I think there are various things that could be done. One is, look, whether we like it or not, some part of this election is going to be controversial. There are always going to be issues raised about, as you said, security and what the electoral verdict may mean. There will always be issues about the fairness of the elections. I think it's in the interest of both the government as well as the international community to have at least a passably fair election. So this is one. The second is what the government should do after that. I think very clearly, they took a very major step with the Grand Loya Jirga to create a kind of consensus around the peace talks. I think that process needs to be continued so that there is a kind of consensus or a unified position in the talks with and I think I feel that all Republican forces, all democratic forces, all those who have been part of the post-Bond generation should close ranks to present a united face against the possibility of an Emirates. It's not just that the Afghan government is considered to be a puppet by the Taliban. In fact, everyone who is represented that post-Bond, let's call it post-American order, is in a way tainted by the same brush. So I think one thing is to put together a unified position, and the third thing is to actually have a delegation that is ready to talk. Now, you can be ready, but the Taliban may still not be willing to talk, as they have not been willing to so far. Now, that is where I think the international community could use its newfound, contacts, familiarity, acquaintanceship with the international community, change track, reset. Instead of now negotiating directly and then forcing the Afghan government to agree with things that they have agreed amongst themselves or can agree amongst themselves, sometimes in their own interest. Now they should actually pressurize them to declare a ceasefire and join their fellow Afghans in talks. Distance themselves from their tutors outside and actually negotiate in good faith with the fellow Afghans.
When you're talking about a ceasefire, Sohail Shaheen now says that the ceasefire was agreed upon but never signed by the Americans, and the Americans backtracked. Violence, which is continuing in Afghanistan, especially with the warnings that the Taliban are giving about the election process itself, is also seen as going to spike, possibly, in this interim. So, how do you view the American position of talking while there is terror in Afghanistan, and India's position vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Okay, I think that's a bit of a long stretch. But even on the violence, I think what was being negotiated, what seems to have been negotiated, I mean, of course, there have been reports, these need to be confirmed, is that, what the Taliban were promising were that violence against foreign troops would be stopped, and that too in a very limited area. I'm not aware, and they've certainly not come out with a very clear statement that they would stop violence against fellow Afghans. So I think that's a very major difference. And to that extent, people have said that this was really more a safe passage agreement. Maybe that is a little bit of an exaggeration. As far as talks while terror, I think that's concerned. I think, as you said, operations were going on from both sides. So it's not that one side was. But I think the nature and the level of violence were very different. Firstly, I think government operations were targeted against militants or terrorists. They may have had collateral damage. Whereas in the case of the Taliban, in many cases, as we know, so many instances where schools, school children, hospitals were also struck, including one, affected even today, that in many cases, and weddings, in many cases, the targets were actually civilians. And in some cases, you could say that they were collateral damage, but the collateral damage was very severely heavy. So I don't think there is a kind of symmetry or a equivalence between the two. And secondly, I think this generally holds true. I mean, particularly to those who advocate talking with the Taliban, that our position with Pakistan has always been no talks while terror. And how can you have a different standard with your friends, the fellow Afghans, and actually counsel them talk while terror goes on? And so I think that's very much. One of the conditions for the talks with the Taliban should be that the Taliban and pressure should be maintained on them. And I have talked otherwise in the past about how pressure can be maintained, both military as well as through Pakistan. That they come to the negotiating table and talk to other Afghans directly instead of the Americans.
But their point is, the Taliban's point is, what do we negotiate with this Intra-Afghan group? This is one of the cards that we have, the ceasefire, that is, for those talks. Otherwise,
that becomes then a justification for terrorism. Where have we ever accepted terrorism as a tool of politics or of foreign policy? Yeah.
So, Ambassador, in the end, do you think India is vindicated by its stand in terms of waiting to see how this process was panning out?
Absolutely. I don't know if that was the intention, but my reading of it is that we were never really convinced about this process. We probably thought that it would meet its own sort of end because of its own contradictions. And I think that has happened. To that extent, we have been vindicated.
But the fact that Ambassador Khalilzad has not lost his job and a new NSA has been named, Ambassador Khalilzad was subpoenaed, but that was withdrawn. He is going to have a confidential briefing in the House. That itself indicates that the door is being kept open by the Americans?
Seems to suggest that. And I think we should be prepared in any case that anything could happen, including, let's call it an unpleasant surprise. But I think certainly this period has allowed a pause to kind of realize what was wrong with that earlier process. And whether it is domestic political pressures or it is international opinion, or maybe it is just their own realization and the fact that the ground has changed. Now with the elections and possibly a new government, the government will also be much stronger in insisting that it be represented either as a government or at least as the umbrella under which a delegation is fielded. So even if it does restart, the terms would have changed, and would have changed in favor of the Afghan government. This is, of course, presuming that you have a reasonably neat outcome, which is, of course, an open question.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, thanks again for speaking to us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.